Did Jesus actually have any brothers? While reading Dr. Richard Carrier's work, I noticed something. St. Paul shaped Christianity more than almost anyone, yet Paul never met Jesus. Paul is given authority over Jesus' message, but when you look closely at who Paul actually met and what he really says about Jesus' family, the story starts to feel thinner than what we're usually told. So in this video, I want to walk through the exact passages, Galatians, Corinthians, and show you what Dr. Richard Carrier thinks they really mean. Because if Paul never met Jesus' brother at all, then nearly everything Paul knew about Jesus may have come from just one man. And that changes a lot. There are big figures in the early church, and then there are really big figures within it. But towering above all of these is Paul. But St. Paul never met Jesus. He wasn't in Jerusalem at the time of his crucifixion, nor was Paul a follower of any kind during Jesus' time. Indeed, prior to becoming a Christian, Paul was a persecutor of the early followers of Jesus and was called Saul of Tarsus. This raises a really interesting question. How did the man who never knew Jesus end up becoming so influential? In my previous video, I looked at Carrier's book, The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus, and if you're interested, I'll put a link in the description. His main arguments were about Jesus being mythical and not a historical person. This is something Carrier has argued for nearly 20 years, and the obsolete paradigm is the most up-to-date version of his arguments. And in this video, I want to look at a specific element of his argument, the idea that St. Paul's story doesn't really stack up. St. Paul was said to have written 13 out of 27 books of the New Testament, although nearly all historians and Bible scholars now agree that several of these were not actually authored by Paul, notably the letters to Timothy. Let me know if you disagree in the comments. Among those which are accepted as being genuine Pauline books are the first letter to the Corinthians and the letter to the Galatians. These are the two texts which Carrier focuses on as one in which Paul appears to refer to the brothers of Jesus. We'll examine them separately in a minute, but it's worth maybe just stopping here to ask who these brothers actually were. After all, the brothers of Jesus are not exactly widely remarked on in popular Christianity. But Jesus was said to have had brothers who were the biological sons of Mary and Joseph. The main reference in the canonical Gospels comes from Mark chapter 6 verse 3. Here Jesus has returned with his disciples to preach in Nazareth. When he does so, the people in the local synagogue ask, "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" And they took offence. So Jesus was said to have had 4 brothers here. And there is even mention of him having unnamed sisters. This view of Jesus as having had multiple brothers is affirmed by some of the non-canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Peter briefly refers to his brothers, while the Proto-Evangelium of James mentions his brothers, but suggests that these are stepbrothers and that they were Joseph's sons from an earlier marriage before he became Mary's husband. And as such, the tradition that Jesus had brothers was reasonably common in the early Christian church. There are 2 specific passages which Carrier focuses on from the Pauline writings. He claims that these are very vague passages and thus do not really constitute evidence of Paul meeting or knowing Jesus' brothers. This is super important, Carrier argues, because who Paul did or didn't meet or know shaped what he did and didn't know about Jesus. For instance, since Paul never knew Jesus personally and was entirely reliant on people's information about the Messiah, the less people who he met that allegedly knew Jesus, the less reliable his writings are as evidence that Jesus actually existed. If, for instance, Paul basically relied almost entirely on Peter as the only individual who had known Jesus personally for his information, then that makes Paul's writings a fairly weak basis for arguing that Jesus did in fact exist. But that doesn't seem to be what Paul says in Galatians. Here he wrote, "After 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you that before God, that what I am writing is no lie." Galatians 1:18-20. It should be noted that when looking at this passage, Cephas was the name which Paul regularly used in his writings for Peter, as Cephas means stone, in other words, rock, in which the Christian church was built after Jesus' time. Thus, we have here a seemingly clear statement that Paul met both St. Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, when he was in Jerusalem. This is argumented by a second seeming reference to Jesus' brothers by Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians. The relevant section here begins abruptly, as it's possible that the passage leading into it has been lost. It starts with somebody saying, "Don't we have the right to food? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living?" The phrase Lord's brothers here, of course, suggests that Paul is yet again referring to Jesus' brothers, though without naming any of them explicitly, as God and Jesus were the Lord in Christian theology. Is it clear that Paul is actually referring to a biological brother of Jesus in Galatians and 1 Corinthians? Carrier notes that Paul frequently uses the term brother and brothers metaphorically to refer to fellow Christians rather than biological relatives. For example, Paul writes, "Brothers, we make known to you the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia," 2 Corinthians 8:1, where brothers clearly refers to fellow believers. Similarly, Paul states, "We have sent with him the brother whose praise in the gospel is known through all the churches," 2 Corinthians 8:18, again using the term in a non-familial sense. On this basis, Carrier argues that the reference to James, the Lord's brother in Galatians 1:19, need not denote a biological sibling of Jesus, but could instead function as a religious or honorific title within the early Christian movement. And Carrier suggests that such a title may have been applied to prominent members of the community, missionaries, or who enjoyed a special spiritual status, comparing to naming practices found in other ancient religious groups. And he further notes that Paul never mentions Jesus' parents, birthplace, upbringing, or earthly family elsewhere in the letters, which in Carrier's view weakens the assumption that Paul is invoking a literal familial relationship here. However, some scholars conclude that Paul's phrasing is intended to distinguish James from other believers and apostles, implying a literal kinship. In Galatians 1:18-19, Paul writes that he visited Cephas and adds, "I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother." Some historians argue that this clarification would be unnecessary if brother of the Lord were merely a general term for Christians, since all believers could be described in that way. As a result, while Carrier's interpretation is grammatically possible and consistent with his broader mythicist framework, yet it is interesting that it remains a minority position within New Testament scholarship. And we might ask, so what? After all, what does it really prove to say that Paul was merely referring to another Christian in Jerusalem rather than James, the biological brother of Jesus? For Dr. Carrier, the issue is that the fewer tangible connections there are between Paul and the earthly Jesus, the weaker the case becomes for Jesus historically existing. If Paul had met James, the brother of Jesus, in Jerusalem, this would constitute a direct personal link between Paul and Jesus' family, thereby strengthening the evidence that Jesus was a real historical figure. And if, however, Paul was simply referring to a fellow member of the early Christian movement, then this link completely disappears, which in turn supports Carrier's broader mythicist framework. And look, there are, however, some scholars here who argue that there are problems with Carrier's line of argument, and at times it can appear to heavily rely on semantic manoeuvring, giving the impression of an argument driven more by reinterpretation than by positive evidence. And this tendency is also evident in Carrier's extended discussion of the reference to James in the writings of Josephus. In Antiquities of the Jews, written in the late 1st century CE, Josephus refers to James, the brother of Jesus. Carrier dismisses this passage, in part due to the well-known textual problems surrounding Josephus's references to Jesus. While it is true that the longer passage describing Jesus is widely regarded as at least partially interpolated, most scholars maintain that the brief reference to James is absolutely authentic. That said, Carrier does raise a number of stimulating and worthwhile questions about how the Pauline letters should be interpreted and how much historical information they can reliably be said to contain. Carrier's discussion of Paul and Jesus' brothers highlighted genuine difficulty interpreting the earliest Christian sources. I think he is absolutely right to emphasise that Paul often uses the language of brother and brothers metaphorically to describe fellow believers, and in the Corinthian passages. This usage is clearly non-biological. That observation rightly cautions us against assuming that every reference to a brother must point to a familial relationship. At the same time, the passage in Galatians presents a more challenging case. Paul's reference to James, the Lord's brother, appears usually specific and seems intended to identify James in a distinctive way. And many scholars therefore take it as a reference to Jesus' biological brother, while Carrier suggests it may still reflect an honorific or community-based title. Whether one finds that proposal persuasive often depends on how much weight is placed on Paul's silence about Jesus' earthly life elsewhere in his letters. What is clear is why this question matters. In Paul's writing, he mentions direct encounters with only a very small number of figures connected to Jesus, most notably Peter and James. If James was indeed Jesus' brother, that provides a second close personal link between Paul and Jesus' earliest circle. If not, Paul's access to first-hand knowledge about Jesus becomes more limited, resting largely on Peter alone. And of course, look, this doesn't settle the question of Jesus' historicity, but it does shape how we understand the nature of Paul's knowledge and the sources behind his theology. This debate shows the value of Carrier's approach in pressing difficult questions about texts that are often read too quickly or too confidently. Whether one ultimately agrees with his conclusions or not, the discussion forces a closer examination of how much historical information Paul's letters can actually be said to preserve. So how do you read Galatians? Was Paul referring to James, the biological brother of Jesus, or to a fellow believer known by an honorific title? And how convincing do you find Carrier's reasoning on this point? Let me know in the comments. Alright, appreciate you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
God complex. Haters love to hate, but I never feel pressed. Got a lot on my plate, but I never get stressed.